Amid their hangovers on New Year's Day, Vikings across the Kingdom of Sweden settled down to one of their most ancient traditions.
You're about to see a story of bold knights and beautiful maidens, a story of love and hatred.
It is so damn
and prejudice.
beautiful.
Though our story is old, the love, the hatred, and the prejudice are ever new.
I know. What if I make some ruined terrain and paint up some knights?
Hey good folks, my name is Leif. Welcome to my YouTube channel called Devs and Dice, where I paint miniatures or craft terrain for the tabletop. Today I'm going to show you how I got inspiration from some miniatures and created these lusciously decrepit ruins. This video will be packed with information, so make sure that you watch the entire thing from start to finish. Yeah, I mean you. I know who you are. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's get started, huh?
We're gonna start this process by bringing out our hot wire foam cutter from Proxxon. I knew from the start that this project was gonna demand a lot of bricks. Now, using the Army Painter foam, I can easily cut these down to be 5mm times 5mm times 10mm. That is usually the measurements I use for all of my bricks. When making bricks, it is advantageous to stack them because you will end up with a lot of bricks in a very short time.
I now have a metric ton of bricks. Good to have. The next step was to define the actual shape of the ruins. I didn't want just plain walls. I wanted verticality, and I wanted to make sure that I had all of the parts figured out. So I looked at some reference images of Gothic architecture and started sketching.
Usually when I sketch, I tend to use large papers that can be 1-to-1 size, so I can easily use them as templates. Also good to have a 28mm model around, just so you can gauge the scale. Once I had a design I liked, I started cutting out the template.
So now it was time to transfer the plans onto some sort of material. My weapon of choice was foam core. Now unfortunately we don't have the easy to peel foam core in Sweden, but in my case that was fine because my plan was to cover everything.
Not everything?
Yes, everything, with individual bricks. Because apparently in some sense I love to torture myself.
One thing that I remembered afterwards was that I needed to add 5mm on each side of these windows. The reason being that I wanted these to have an opening that was 1 inch wide, and each brick will of course take 5mm on each side. Each floor is cut from foam core and glued into place using hot glue.
Now at this point I did something less than ideal. I knew I wanted some sort of pillars at the corners of the building. My first thought was to use my shifting lance circle jig to cut round pillars, to contrast that square look of all of the future bricks. It was a good thought, but honestly I came up with an even better solution, which you will see later in the process.
The first type of bricks that I started laying in wasn't actually the bricks for the walls, but the bricks for the floors. Now, one thing I want you to think about when you do these kinds of builds is to think about orientation and shapes of different things. Here, I wanted some variation between what I perceived being quite a brick-heavy build, so I made these tiles flat and diagonal.
Now I'm gonna let you in on a YouTube crafting secret of mine. Similar to how a well-formed adventuring party has a scout ahead to clear the road, I usually make one of my terrain pieces a little bit more complete so I can gauge what the end result will be. Does it look good? Does the piece achieve what I want?
All important questions that demand answering.
Well, in my case, you can see that the pillars looked okay, but in my humble opinion, they looked a little bit too cartoony. It bothered me, so I removed the irritation with a swift swing of my blade.
Now, hopefully if you're paying attention, you won't have to do the same mistakes I do. The better solution that I mentioned was, of course, to use Shifting Lands Pillars templates. Using this, I actually quite simply can get much more well-defined pillars that will contrast a lot against the bricks and bring some well-needed nice architectural details.
Our ruins have verticality, and we need some way for our minis to traverse to high ground. In 1 minute, I'm gonna show you how I made some miniature-friendly step ladders. Ready? Let's go!
Alright, so for this I'm gonna be using popsicle sticks. The first thing I do is I use my saw and slide it sideways to create a nice exaggerated wooden groove. Now here I'm measuring where the approximate steps will be. Then I cut them at an angle using any sort of saw or clippers. Anything goes. Once I know how many steps I need, I cut these out. These are approximately 1 inch in width. I use super glue and some activator to make sure that these bond quickly. Please pay attention to the exact angle also of your steps. It's important that gravity helps our miniature to stand on the step. Finally, I lock everything in using some wood glue. For a more traditional ladder, I'm going to start with a barbecue skewer. The skewer is made of bamboo. I drill some holes where I want steps, and then for the steps I use some toothpicks which I taper off at the ends. Then I use some PVA glue and push them into the holes. Getting both sides to match can be a little bit challenging, but just take your time. Now back to the build. Here I'm using a rock to get some nice stone texture on the pillars. Then I glue them onto the sides of the buildings, and this isn't ideal. If I were to redo this, I would do it quite differently, but I had to cut out each of the sides just to give the illusion that the pillar actually goes through. Now the first bricks, I'm actually not going to cut them because usually I cut my bricks in half, because here I'm defining sort of a floor and window line. Also, one of the more important things is to make sure to brick all of the openings. Once that was done, I took some square dowels and I textured them using the saw, dragging it. You can see it gets a really nice texture. I wanted some beams. This might not make any sense whatsoever, but you know what? It visually was very appealing, and sometimes I feel like if it's plausible and it looks good, then go with what looks good, in my opinion. Here you can see that I'm just cutting out some of the pre-inserted bricks just to place these square dowels going to the outside, and on the other side I just push them into the soft bit of the foam core. Now once that was done, it was finally time to start bricking. These bricks I actually cut in half. Partly it's because I get twice as many bricks, but it's also because these lay much more flatter to the wall, and those bricks that I placed first will protrude ever so slightly, which is an effect I like.
I want to mention my inspiration for this project. The original thought of this Warhammer or Mordheim looking ruin came from seeing these wonderful miniatures made by this video sponsor, Highland Miniatures. Highland Miniatures make some awesome old school style sculpts, which have their own world and lore, but can also be used as proxy models for any Warhammer Fantasy Empire army or a Mordheim warband. Printing out these pre-supported models worked without any problems, and removing the supports was exceptionally easy. Well, if truth be told, it became easy after Ramon over at Highland Miniatures told me of the ancient secret of dipping the models into hot water. The thing that impressed me the most about the models was the choice of details. See, the miniatures are simple, but detail, which enables me to paint them more easily. And I think the result shows it. Stay tuned until the end to see how I painted these minis up. So thank you so much to Ramon and Highland Miniatures for sponsoring this video. Links to their My Mini Factory page and their Patreon page can be found in the description down below.
I wanted these runes to be secure, so I cut out some board bases. These I hot glued on, and you can see they actually fit quite nicely. Then I textured everything using some of my gravel from the army painter.
Our ruins are coming together. But if this were walls from an old fortification, shouldn't there be some stairs? Oh, come on, Leif. Stairs never look good and play well in D&D. I agree, but what if I told you that I can make some stairs that look good and plays well for games such as D&D? Let's go.
So this one was actually quite easy. I usually use Tinkercad, and as you can see, the measurements are down there. The idea is really that you have a stair with landings. Now, in order to make this work well for instance, D&D, you have to ensure that each landing can have a 1-inch miniature, and each landing should only be 1 inch away from the adjacent landing. If you do that, then quite easily you will end up with a stair that, well, anyone can fight in. You will have increments where they will stop, but it will actually work according to the rules. As you can see, I cut up a whole bunch of thin slices that looks a little bit something like that, and I also took into account the 5mm for the bricks. So once you cover that with bricks, it will actually look quite amazing. Now, as per usual, I had some pillars left over and I had some bricks left over. So I figured I would do some scatter terrain pieces that I could use just to create some cover here and there among the ruins. These were quite simple to do, just hot glue them into place and then use some bricks to tell the story of how these ruins have collapsed. Again, have a miniature close by so you can dry fit it and make sure that they work. All in all, I made 4 of these scatter terrain pieces, and I think they actually fill a nice function. Here you can see what all of the stairs and scatter terrain and ruins look like once I have covered them with some gravel and various basing materials. At this point, what we're after is really a difference in textures more than anything else. Now, while we look at me mod podging, I want to extend a thank you to all of my patrons. You have been very patient with me, and I know I haven't released nearly as many videos this year as I wanted to. Hopefully next year will be better. I want to extend a special thank you to my champion level patrons Eric Ortman, Magnus Solberg, Rosengraveyard, 4VXP, Madners, and my legend level patrons Niklas Swedenlind and Leander.
So the construction is done and everything is mod podged. The visual goal I had in my mind wasn't exactly defined, but I did know what the anti-vision was, and that was plain grey stone terrain. I wanted these pieces to look weathered, to tell a story, but the first step was to start with the priming.
Now, winter is here in Sweden, so I chose to prime with my airbrush. Once I had done that, I go over everything with a zenithal spray, and here I'm using Army Painter's white from their airbrush line. Now, I wanted to make everything a little bit more earthy, so I'm actually coming in here with some transparent burnt umber inks. And I can not recommend this because I kid you not, I emptied an entire bottle. Once that had dried, I go over everything with not a dry brush really. This is more like a stipple with some dark gray. This is the moment where I'm starting to think more about direction, and this is when I'm coming in with some lighter gray, and here I'm using a larger brush to start defining where the light comes from. Now take your time doing this, and rather you have a little bit less paint in your brush than more. Here I'm doing the final sort of detail of the paint scheme, and this is me coming in with a warm cream color, which I'm dry brushing and paying attention to the direction. The next step was actually to use my airbrush, and here I'm using some military green wash from Army Painter. I'm starting to make up a, well, not a story, but more a history about where, moss might start growing, where, water starts to gather. While the wash was drying, I figured I would start painting all of the beams in a dark brown color, and then dry brushing them with a honey brown color. You can really see all of that texture popping out from the wood. Now in this process, I also used some strong tone actually, which I diluted so that it would go easily through my airbrush, and I basically painted all of the previously green places at the bottom just to get some nice color modulation. And this is where I started to also think more about where would water have gathered, where would it had caused some streaks. So you can see I'm using my airbrush, and layer by layer I'm starting to build up different colorations and starting to think about the history of this place. Now I'm coming in with quite diluted brown paint, and I'm just covering all of the ground and everywhere where I added some gravel. But even this I'm diluting, and this wasn't planned, but I'm just diluting it with water and making streaks and a little bit more interesting colors. Now for the ground layer, I just came in with my homemade wash, which I've made from just some cheap paints and some water and some flow aid. Once that has dried somewhat, we will come in and we will dry brush the ground. And here I'm trying to think about all of the openings where light would sort of go through, just so it's not just from one direction. Now I wanted some tufts, and I went with these 3 tufts from the Army Painter. One trick that I think I've shown before is that you can actually cut tufts in half, which makes it quite easy to put them up against a wall. And with that, let's have a look at the final result.